Good morning, and welcome to the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce 8th edition in the webinar series, COVID-19, What Lies Ahead? Opening and the reopening, and also the geopolitics and reports from the field. I am John Welch, Executive Director of the Brazilian American Chamber, and on behalf of the Chamber, we wish you all health and safety in this difficult time. As the world embarks on reopening from COVID-19, its dimensions span everything from health, how business will evolve, geopolitics. We have brought together two specialists on both the pace of opening and the possible geopolitical implications. Mr. Richard Jantz from Cushman Wakefield will cover current executive orders in New York relating to business, reopening, and safety precautions instituted by landlords and occupiers to keep their spaces safe. Also, part of the discussion will cover trends in back to office efforts with regard to current space utilization and reconfiguration. His point of reference is Cushman Wakefield's experience in China, although he will not address the Chinese experience directly. Mr. Anthony Bishop of Signum Capital Advisors will look at the geopolitical implications of opening, starting with China, then traveling the globe, including Brazil and the United States. And our moderator today is Aaron Shire. He is Director of Business Development for Cushman & Wakefield's Manhattan offices, where he leads over 60 brokerage professionals. He's also a board member of the Chamber. He began his career in the commercial real estate business in 1999 at Colliers ABR & Company, one of the predecessor companies to Cushman & Wakefield, where he was appointed the youngest managing director in the firm's history. Mr. Shire specializes in tenant representation, predominantly assisting international financial institutions implement strategic, cost-effective real estate solutions. Before turning the screen over to Aaron, I would ask you to please use the Q&A tab for your questions. You can make them at any time, and we will look to answer them as our guests finish their comments and get into the discussion. Thank you very much. Aaron?
Thank you, John. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining. As John alluded to, we are certainly dealing with very uncertain and unprecedented times, which is why I'm very excited to be the moderator for today's panel to hear from experts who are both leading best practices and research as it relates to things that are happening both on the ground right now here in New York City, around the country, and also from a macro perspective. We're also going to be hearing some great insights as well from that point. So what I'd like to do briefly is introduce first Richard Jantz, who's joining us. Richard is an executive managing director at Cushman & Wakefield. Richard has been in the business for over 26 years and specializes in working with owners and occupiers as it relates to development of infrastructure, construction, and things along those lines. And after an introduction to the real estate and construction industry through two of the largest construction firms in New York City, Mr. Jantz helped establish the structured approach to the discipline of real estate project management that is implemented routinely today. The structured approach included standardization of scope of services, reporting, and financial oversight best practices, memorialized in a published copywritten project management manual that has acted as the basis of training programs in some of the world's largest project management services firms. In every phase of his career, Richard has bridged the gap between the business of a project and the day-to-day business operations. His experience spans the lead project management of the team that constructed Time Warner Center, as well as Madison Square Garden reinvention. Most recently, his firm, Integrity Consulting Group, was acquired by Cushman & Wakefield and was named Executive Managing Director, leading the tri-state region for project and development services. Mr. Jantz holds a Bachelor of Science in Architectural Technology from New York Institute of Technology and a Master of Architecture from Syracuse University, as well as in Florence, Italy, in addition to attending the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you very much, everyone. And I'm actually gonna share my screen, so we have a short deck that we can get through. I just wanted to thank everyone for welcoming me and the panelists here to talk about this. We know that there's so much information that's swirling around everyone, and it's great to get together and really share some ideas on the pragmatic reality of what we're dealing with right now. I wish everyone is safe and healthy as they make their way through this. Overall, UC&W has been and positioned itself as a true leader when all of this happened in early January into March, and the stay-at-home orders in New York. The platform that we had established and put in place over the past couple of years is really stepped up in supporting businesses from end to end across this issue. For me personally, here in the tri-state, I manage 120 project managers across the 3 locations. About 40 of them sit in what we call the markets group, where we deal with one-off projects for clients. And then we have another 70 or 80 people that sit on site with large clients like Verizon and MasterCard and many others. And so we really have a very unique insight into a lot of the things that are happening. And I'm sitting on calls, a dozen calls a week with different clients, reviewing their reentry plans, trying to help them understand and sort through what options are available to them and how it's all coming together. So we feel really privileged to provide that guidance to those people as we go through it. So overall, we have, our recovery readiness is what we're calling this reentry. So it really is about taking the principles of safety that are set out by the CDC, the government, and state, and really applying them to the reality of buildings and spaces, and of course, people's feeling safe, which is one of the most important things. And I believe that our biggest challenge from this point forward will be unraveling the fear around how this issue spreads, how people can remain safe, and we're going to talk about all of that today. Just a little bit of feedback, as John had alluded to earlier. From our experience in China, we have over 1 million workers and 800 million square foot of property under management in China. So we are applying the lessons learned on the work that we had done from the 4th quarter, when this really kind of ramped up in China, into their reopening in February, March to today. And what was very interesting was the Chinese and Japanese had a leg up on us and had a leg up on this disease. And the reason why is because they basically had done 90% of this work for the SARS outbreak a couple of years ago. So they had essentially taken all of that learning and all of those handbooks and all of those safety measures. They opened them back up, dusted it off, and said, what differences are being presented to us with coronavirus, and how can we apply the safety and the techniques that we use for SARS to this particular issue? So we definitely had a head start in that region of the world, and I think how quickly they got it under control relatively after they realized it became a problem. How quickly they got it under control and how quickly they reopened without major spikes or issues coming out of it is really an example, I think, for us as we reopen. So that's really important. We look at this in 3 phases as we start talking about guidance. It's the immediate, which is what people, landlords, buildings have to do to get ready to go back to work. And then there's the transition period of as we go from that 25% to the 50% to the 75% occupancy, and watching how the spread of the virus hopefully doesn't occur, and we're able to get back to some sense of capacity. And then the post-vaccine period. And so we are entrenched right now in this phase 1 immediate. How do I get my space ready? How do I get my building ready? Dealing with mass transit and a lot of those issues. And we're going to quickly get into, in the next 30 to 60 days, we are going to be in that transition of phase 1 and getting back to work. We are there in many states around the country. New York obviously has lagged a little bit because of just how badly and how hard hit we were. So, from there, I wanted to talk about, how we do that in C&W. And one of the most important things we put in place, we had a very robust workplace consulting team, which would help clients understand how their company's employee base operates at the highest capacity. So we actually took all that knowledge and all those consultants, and with the work from home structure, and we actually built what's called the experience per square foot at home surveys. And we have done this for a couple of hundred companies in certainly across the country, but in the tri-state. And we've actually collected over 50,000 data points of how people are dealing with their work and their time from home, how productive they're being, how we are monitoring, how our companies are monitoring their work, and can this really work, right? So the response period of this, and a lot of our guidance has been living in that respond column. Obviously, we are quickly getting into the reopen column. I'm sure many of you have heard about our 6-foot office concept, which is essentially, we had done an incubator version of this in our Netherlands office. We reconfigured the office and we showed how this, as a first shot, how directional walkways and how pinch points and safety measures can be instituted in an office and have it reopen. And there's been some fantastic reaction to that. And then obviously reimagining. So in phase 3 of this thing, what will remain as best practice in work from home? Will more people be working from home? Most likely, yes, to some extent. Will the office go away? We don't believe that it will. We believe that the social capital and the need for people to interact in teams together will never fully go away, but there's going to be an office ecosystem that is developed, which is a combination of work from home, remote work across regions, and then of course in office meetings. So we believe that's all going to happen. So that is where we're seeing this progress currently. Just to react or just to restate the baseline of all of our guidance. Our Safe 6 has been the establishment of, and it's very much common sense now, you've all heard it 100 times, what you need to do, what you need to prepare to have your workplace and your workforce ready to re-engage. And it's simple, prepare the building, right? So you're going to get your building ready. You're going to have the entry protocols, a screening, all of those things, and we'll talk about them a little bit further. You're going to have to prepare your workforce. They have to understand that there is a voluntary piece to this, then there is the safe piece of it, then there is how they work in the ecosystem and how they get to and from the office. And we'll talk a little about that. Access control is again, how we're screening people to get in and out of locations, whether it's at your building front door or is it at your elevator door on your floor, in some cases, a hybrid of both. The social distancing plan is basically what the 6-foot office is based on, and it is how you can keep people working at a distance that is safe but still foster some social connectivity. Reduce touch points and increase cleaning. We see a lot of focus around pantries and congregant areas. So do you shut those down? Do you minimize touch points? Do you have an attendant cleaning? And then communicate for confidence. One of the most important things that we are providing to our clients and even our own tenancy is tell people what's going on. Let them understand exactly how we're cleaning. You let them understand exactly how we're screening, what the expectations are. You have to communicate regularly and clearly so that people can understand and manage the fear of having to come to work and be exposed to something that they just cannot be exposed to for many different reasons. So I want to talk a little bit about where we are on the overview. So as of June 8th, and this is looking forward a little bit, but we have some pretty good confidence and information from the governor's office. As of June 8th, the entire tri-state will be in the phase 1 reopening. And that is this Monday coming. As you know, many areas of New York State and certainly Connecticut, Jersey, and even beyond have entered into phase 1. Phase 1 is identified as industrial, curbside retail, and construction. So that will 100% be in this region open in phase 1 as of June 8th. And that is really important. It's going to be a very interesting study to see how on day 1, on Monday, approximately 130,000 construction workers will converge on New York City, which is about half the workforce. So that when jobs restart at a lower capacity, we are going to see our first influx of people into a metropolitan area as dense as New York. And we've put a lot of guidance together on how construction sites will maintain safety, space, cleanliness, PPE, all of those things that you hear and we've been talking about. Interestingly, the state guidelines are providing for commercial buildings entering phase 2 that was released on June 3rd. I want to make sure I clarify that that hasn't happened on June 3rd. It was released on June 3rd. So the governor's office actually put out really clear guidance on what landlords and buildings should be doing, as well as tenant spaces in the commercial world. That information came out. John, if you would like, I can actually forward that to you, and you can make that available to anyone who's interested if they have not seen it. And there's some very broad guidelines following the Safe Six. So it's really interesting information, and we believe that will happen in New York City on June 22nd, assuming no spike or no major issues with the COVID spread. The 2-week period of phase 1 will go from June 8th to June 22nd. So that's kind of our phase 1, phase 2 transfer in the hardest hit area of New York. Other areas are entering phase 2 as early as next Tuesday or Wednesday. So for example, Long Island entered phase 1 last Wednesday. Mid-Hudson entered last Tuesday. That means next Tuesday and next Wednesday, they will enter phase 2. And intermediate reports on that first week has actually been quite positive. There has not been a spike in hospitalizations. There has not been a spike in cases. Of course, you have your incubation period, so we're still on a little bit of pins and needles, but we believe that things are, people's proactive approach to managing it are yielding good results. Interestingly, and one thing I wanted to bring out in that guidance that came out yesterday was every business and every building must provide a statement of readiness. So the governor's office has actually put this guidance out, and there's a link on the bottom as a business owner or a landlord that you have to click on that link. It brings you to a website, and you have to attest that you are following the above criteria. This is an administrative nightmare. I don't know how they're going to manage this going forward with the influx of thousands and thousands and thousands of businesses and buildings saying that they are ready to go. But every landlord that I've spoken to, and I sit on the Revenue board, and we were just on a call yesterday with them, many of them have been operating all along. So they feel very confident that they can make that statement that they are ready to open based on those requirements. So that's just an overview of kind of what's happened in the past week to 10 days. All good things, and we're certainly trending in a positive direction. So what are some of the specific challenges we have? Landlord building preparation. So we're seeing a vast, diverse kind of interpretation of what the requirements are to open a building, and many of those and some landlords are choosing not to necessarily screen or temperature check people at the front door. They want the tenants to do that on their tenant floors before they enter the space. Some are doing thermal cameras. Some are putting attendants. Some have queues for elevators. Some are restricting elevators. Some aren't. So it's a very interesting diversity in how landlords are looking at this from a liability standpoint, from the DNA of their own organization, all the way to interpreting the direction, which is intentionally vague in some areas from the governor's office, to allow people to be responsible and do what they need to do. So these preparations have been going on. I think a recent concern has come up with any building that has been shuttered for a fair bit of time has to go through a building startup commissioning process. So you need to check your water in your tanks, make sure to manage Legionnaires. Your HVAC systems have to be started up, and filtration needs to be updated. A bunch of different things on the systems of the buildings must occur in the next 2 weeks before they start to handle populations. However, many buildings, and we manage about 4 million square feet in Manhattan with our asset managers. We have been maintaining those buildings, and those buildings have been open, even though the entire ecosystem of a building has not been in use. So those preparations are underway, and it's a huge burden on all landlords right now to make sure that they are prepared for phase 2 to handle tenancy. Another interesting thing that everybody seems to be focusing on is elevator use, right? It is the tightest concentration of people, other than a subway, which we'll get to in a minute, that you will encounter on your way to work. So if you're on a lower floor, many people will have responded to surveys that they would rather walk. But basically, if you've got PPE and face coverings, you can fill an elevator to 50% of its capacity. So initial guidance was 1 person per elevator. that caused a nightmare of scenarios of building people wrapped around the block waiting for their elevators to bring them up to their floors, even at 50% capacity. So the single-use elevator has kind of gone away a little bit with enhanced cleaning. They're talking about cleaning 3 to 4 times per day the elevator cabs, and keeping that capacity to 50% with face coverings. We think that we'll be able to manage that elevator queue and that use for social distancing. Tenant space preparations, right? So just as landlords are dealing with their 3 populations, their own employees, the tenancy and the tenants who come in, and of course the third party of food delivery and UPS and FedEx and construction and everything else, they have a really interesting problem because they have to solve for 3 populations converging on the building. Tenants have to deal with their own company structure and making sure that their spaces are prepared with walkways and pinch points and reduced conference room density. So chairs are disappearing. How do you deal with core bathrooms? I've gotten lots of requests on how do I disable a middle sink on a 3-sink bank in a bathroom? How can I disable every other urinal and things of that nature? So these conversations are in very, very heavy rotation right now, and we actually have been have just been conferring with the MTA on how they can reopen for their 30,000 employees on every different type of space, from MRO maintenance facilities to subway booths to bus depots to the physical cars and buses that they run. So we have come and we're really helping them kind of sort through all of this stuff so they can get their employees as well as folks back to work. And of course, mass transit is everybody's concern right now. And I did an informal survey of my staff in the New York City office and said who would voluntarily come back to the office, and every single person responded back, we have no problem coming to the office, but we're really concerned about how we get there because New York is a major commuting hub. So subways and Long Island Railroad and Metro North Railroad and all of those are still a major source of congregation and fear for people on how it can spread. So we can control the path from the front door of a building to elevators to tenant spaces. We can control everything. What we can't control is mass transit. So we're trying to figure out how to get that under control. And I want to just kind of continue with some trends from the field. One thing I want to state is that there is a tremendous amount of pragmatism being practiced across businesses, from financial services to retail to everything. We are not seeing clients come to us and say, I need to rip out my entire fit out and spread it out to 6-foot office, or eliminate conference rooms, or I don't want to ever see a pantry in my space again. We're seeing protections put in place to manage this until we can get to that phase 3 post vaccine world that we talked about. But we're not seeing people putting projects on hold for that reason. We are not seeing major redesign, and we are not seeing installations that have recently been completed ripped out. It will be very interesting to see how architects adjust to this going forward. And I think we will see some after effects of the reality of what occurred making its way into architecture, which is very common. Architecture is a societal kind of incubator. So whatever happens in society will eventually show up in buildings and spaces that we all use. But we're seeing a lot of pragmatism from clients. Maintaining workforce safety is of the utmost importance. How you clean, how you touch, how you dispose of things from your desks, how you get food deliveries. It's all about that safe 6 and how a workforce can be made safe. And people are all publishing really, really clear plans. So that's really important, a trend that we're seeing. I wanted to share with you guys just a quick floor plan on how we are analyzing a company's plan. So what you see on your screen is essentially a typical office floor with a side core, and you can see the elevators and the stairs grayed out in dark, and you can see arrows that are running around the spaces. So those are your directional flows of folks. So we're seeing people able to move around the space. The red dots are pinch points where we see a convergence of those walkways. and those are danger areas. So we flag them so we can put proper signage up. And then you can see the conference rooms are being reduced in density, with individual seats staggered across in kind of a checkerboard pattern so that people are not directly facing one another or sitting adjacent to one another. So we actually provide this service. We can take your a company's floor plans and we can do this analysis for you. And then our PDS team can implement the signage and the changes and whatever modifications we need to do. So we are doing this for a fair bit of clients across the board. And just a little bit, zoom in a little bit more, you can see how we are spacing for reentry. You can see the checkerboard pattern on the left, where you can see how meeting room capacities are being analyzed, one-way circulation, and some other considerations like pantries and cleaning and things of that nature. So that's basically where we are. Aaron, I'm going to send it back to you, and I'm happy to answer any questions as we get into the next phase of this thing. Thank you.
Great, Richard. Thank you so much. And again, if anyone has any questions, please just type them into the chat. I know, Richard, you covered a lot. There's certainly much to consider as we start to engage with the workplace once again. So thank you, Richard, for your insights.
My pleasure.
Please stay on the line, Richard. We're going to actually now turn it over. That was a great micro perspective on what New York is looking like. Now, Andrew Bishop, a partner and global head of policy research of Signum Global Advisors. I'm going to introduce Andrew. Andrew Bishop, partner and global head of policy research at Signum Global Advisors, is an established political analyst with a track record of advising institutional investors, corporates, and governments on political risks in developed, emerging, and frontier markets. He is also head of Signum's Washington, D.C. office. Mr. Bishop joined Signum from Eurasia Group, where he served as deputy head of research and was also director in the firm's global macro practice. Prior to that, he was senior manager in the World Economic Forum Strategic Foresight and Risk Analysis Unit, during which he regularly participated in the organization's annual meeting in Davos. He is term member of the Council on Foreign Relations and actively participates in the Munich Security Conference Leadership Program. Mr. Bishop holds a master's degree from the London School of Economics and Sciences Po, Paris, and was a fellow at Johns Hopkins University in Washington, D.C. So without further ado, Andrew, we'd love to hear from you regarding the macro perspective.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me. So I'll keep my remarks brief so we have some time for Q&A. But essentially, the first thing I wanted to address, and which really reinforces many of the points Richard has made, is that we at Signum really do not believe that real estate and economic activity, but real estate in particular, are dead as a result of COVID. In fact, we still see a lot of opportunity in the sector. For one thing, while there's been a lot of talk about how airlines, for example, would have a hard time sort of operating at subcapacity in a profitable way, that is not the case for example, the cinema industry, where we're seeing, Richard was talking about developments in Japan. We're seeing how innovations that began, for example, in Japan are now being adopted in the U.S. and interestingly inland in the U.S. So not necessarily sort of the New York, LA that you would expect, but actually some of the more sparsely populated areas are using that as a test kit almost, or test drive. So there's really a lot that still can happen. And interestingly, from a real estate perspective, there's obviously a pretty neat correlation between the need for social distancing and greater space and sort of square footage, if you will. So there's untapped potential there. And there's a sort of a micro sector angle to that. I was just referring cinemas. But there's also of course, a political and a country angle to that. So for example, China is now considering, as part of its recently released fiscal push, is now considering a sort of second wave of urbanization, where technically speaking, or officially speaking, this is essentially not urbanization, it's actually support to rural areas. So essentially with the idea that, rural areas were hit particularly hard by the COVID crisis, in part because of their remoteness, the lack of, healthcare infrastructure, and sort of presence of developed infrastructure in those remote areas, those poorer areas inland. And so as a result of that, part of what's going into the fiscal push right now has to do with developing those areas and, interestingly, sort of bridging the gap, if you will, between the urban and the rural, which again, from a real estate perspective, offers some major opportunities. So you've heard a lot about, how people were arguably or predictions around the fact that people might be shifting back towards more rural lifestyles, preferences to be in sparsely populated areas. That may be true, but we don't interpret that as meaning sort of the decline of urbanization. If anything, and I don't mean to be, arguing for killing the trees, but if anything, it's a window of it's an opportunity for greater real estate development to meet those needs, including in things like the healthcare sector, right? So I'm not just talking about strip malls, but really some other sort of more investments more in line with COVID specifically. And I'll just mention another point here, which is that completely agree with Richard as well. And I think someone had been making this point recently that, part of you've heard a lot about how the transition to remote working has been pretty seamless for a lot of the sort of digital focused jobs, right? The jobs that can be done remotely. And that's true in the short run. But as Richard was hinting at, you really need to build that social capital. And a lot of what we're doing now is running on legacy. So we definitely expect that the remote working trend has been a little bit overblown. Not so much, again, because it can't be done from an efficiency standpoint, but more because a lot of what happens in the workplace is not just about efficiency, or at least not short-term efficiency. And then the last thing I'll mention on this front is the fact that this is not going to be the last pandemic. And so while, there may be a little bit of hesitancy at the moment for some investors to rush into, sort of adapting infrastructure to pandemic needs because there's this idea that, it's a short-term shock to the system. It might be just one season, maybe it's 2 seasons, 2 waves, 2 winters, but probably not beyond. And therefore might not warrant long-term investments. That's a very short-termist view. And as Richard was saying, those countries that really invested post-SARS in Asia, for example, or post-H1N1 in 2009, have been benefiting now. And so from that standpoint, paradoxically, a pretty severe phase 2 or wave 2 in the next winter, or potentially things like not reaching a vaccine as quickly as has been heralded, which is something we're quite bearish about at Signum. We're a little bit worried that hopes in a sort of this consensus that we will get a vaccine in 12 to 18 months. While that may be accurate and it may even be base case, it is not 100% guarantee, and people have been rushing into that a little bit too much. And so my point with all of this is to say that if and when it becomes clear to investors that pandemics are not a one-off event, but really something that we need to learn to live with, a little bit like hurricanes and other natural disasters, you could see some durable shifts in the sector. The second thing the second sort of theme I'll address is reopenings per se. So here, we at Signum think that a little bit too much focus has gone into indices and other types of trackers that really track how much economic activity has rebounded since the official reopenings have started. Those trackers, whether it's the open table data, a lot of the sort of, bank proprietary models, a lot of the airline, traffic, IATA and that kind of sort of indicators, they're useful to get a sense of what is going on right now. The problem is that as an investor with a sort of slightly longer term horizon, and even if it's not extremely long term, and in real estate it would tend to be, but even if it weren't, you're still looking at a situation where the virus situation is such that you could have a snapback. And I'm not even referring necessarily to a massive second wave, but just to sort of social jitters. And Richard was talking about making sure that people have confidence and trust in the system. And so what we're arguing at Signum is that one should focus a little bit less on the level of economic activity at moment X right now, and rather focus more on which countries are best positioned to make that rebound and that recovery sustainable. And what I mean by sustainable is essentially looking at some of the underlying technical and policy items that will support the recovery, not just in the coming weeks, but in the coming months. So I'll get a little bit more specific. One of them is obviously the technical ability to reopen, right? And so what I mean by that is you can reopen very quickly once you've seen that your caseload, has gone down or stabilized. But if you don't have an ability to continue with testing and especially track and tracing, you're essentially opening yourself up for a potential relapse. And interestingly, in the US, for example, it's been estimated that you would need approximately 300,000 staff members to man an operation of track and testing across the country. And right now, the US is estimated to have just above 8,000 workers dedicated to that task. So this is one point. Well, I'll get into the divide between developed markets and emerging markets, but we're quite bullish on emerging markets. And this is one area where, interestingly, you might think that because we're talking about testing and we're talking about sort of medical capacity to a certain extent, developed markets would necessarily have an edge. But actually, a country like India that has been taking, staffing up seriously could potentially be better off than the U.S. So this is not to say that India will end up doing better off than the U.S., but rather to say that if you look below the hood, if you will, there are some interesting sort of angles that might actually benefit some countries over others, and not always the most obvious ones. That's for the technical capacity. There's also obviously a very important political and sort of socio-political angle to reopening. And here, the most obvious one is the popularity of leaders and their ability to sort of steer populations and build trust. But I would mention that while all leaders have gotten a bump throughout the COVID crisis, or most leaders, most political leaders, and while it's been heavily reported that some of the more, herd immunity, quote unquote reckless, because I don't want to make a judgment, but perceived as reckless by many people, some of those leaders like President Trump, like AMLO and López Obrador in Mexico, like Bolsonaro in Brazil, they've been heavily criticized, by the media, et cetera, and some of their polling has taken a hit. But if you look, their polling has not taken a dramatic hit. I mean, Bolsonaro's, as many of you will probably know better than I do, his base is still really sticking with him in a way that's been sort of surprising to many observers. That core 30-35% has been more resilient than expected. AMLO has lost a few percentage points in popularity, but he's still well above 50% and frankly doing surprisingly well. And so where I'm going with this is this idea that, again, you want to be looking at popularity of leaders as an important factor, but you don't necessarily want to focus on the media narrative around those leaders and rather really look at the hard data of the polling. Another angle here is that in terms of political leadership is that there's been a lot of talk about, what's better, having an authoritarian regime or a democratic regime, having a federal regime or a centralized one. From the COVID perspective, I mean, not normatively. And I think the answer here is that this is a little bit sort of binary, a little bit too exaggerated, but big picture, from a health standpoint, you essentially want to have a democratic regime because they're going to be far more responsive to the population's concerns. But from a sort of from an economic standpoint, from a sort of economic rebound point of view, strong men have tended to fare a little bit better, in no small part because they're able to both enforce lockdowns with a stronger hand and conversely sort of, give a real kick to the economy to reboot it once they ease the lockdowns. And then the last point I'll make on the sort of political and socio-political considerations, which I think is something that's gone largely underappreciated, is that we at Signum are particularly worried about countries where public opinion about what should come first, what should be prioritized, the economy first or healthcare first. We think that there is from an analytical standpoint, there is no right or wrong answer there, but the situation you want to avoid, and by implication, the potential countries that might not be ready for investment, are the ones where the polarization is high, where essentially the population is split 50-50. And a very interesting case study here, I think, is Germany, where Merkel has been lauded for her very competent response to the virus, and that is all accurate, and she's gotten plaudits for it. But the German population is pretty evenly 50-50 divided over what to prioritize. And we think that that is a good example of a situation where the medical crisis was handled well, but the economic and political rebound might actually be pretty heated. France would be another country. And this really speaks to the fact that if you're looking at this from a sort of global asset allocation perspective, you don't want to put too much emphasis on the medical component of the situation. It's obviously a medical tragedy, but from an investment standpoint, you could have situations like South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore that have masterfully handled the crisis medically, but because of their extreme dependence on global flows, global trade, and sort of openness of the global economy, which is not, set to rebound anytime soon, they will actually potentially be far more impacted than a country like Indonesia or Brazil that has handled this less well politically and medically, but actually potentially has the benefit of a greater domestic market. Brazil is a little bit different because of the commodity exports, but Indonesia, India, the US for that matter would be good examples there. And then I'll just briefly mention or touch on the third theme, which is essentially, what happens next in the second wave, if you will. So we are actually very optimistic about the summer, and we have been for several months now. And the reason for that is that we feel like there's been a little bit too much sort of intellectual hair splitting around, do temperatures affect the virus or not? And it's not a black or white situation. So you don't need to have a paper that is peer reviewed and then finally finds that hot and humid weather will completely render the virus, uncontagious. That is not going to happen. But a minor improvement thanks to temperature, plus natural social distancing from being outdoors more, plus stronger immune systems, plus the fact that the lockdowns have had the effect of bringing the case infection loads lower, and therefore any rebound, even if it happens, will take 6 to 8 weeks to really appear in the data. All of that to us means that we're in for a pretty positive summer. And I think the market has been reflecting that in no small part. The problem, however, is that we caution against taking that to mean that the crisis is over. And while that may sound obvious, we have been hearing from a lot of investors that because the reopening is going well now, that probably means we can just, deal with it when it comes back in the winter. And we're not so convinced that the winter will be that rosy. If there's anything to be learned from the Spanish flu in 1918, is that number one, there was a second wave. In fact, there were 3 waves. Like most of these viruses. Number 2, the second wave was actually the hardest one. So what I mean by that is that when you think Spanish flu, you're actually thinking the second wave. The first wave was fairly benign. And then the third one is the fact that we're worried that in countries, especially in developed and Western markets, where sort of, population's desires comes above all, in part because these countries are democracies, there's a slight sense that, if things get well, then we'll lower our guards, we'll stop wearing masks. And you're already hearing in the retail industry and in supermarkets that workers are complaining about the fact that consumers who were very obedient during the lockdown are increasingly reluctant to abide by the rules. And so we're very worried about sort of social behavior changing and becoming too complacent in the West in particular. Now, just to finalize, I'd say that the political implication here is that while a lot of governments, and including governments that were completely reckless and sort of frankly incompetent in managing the crisis the first time around, they were given a free pass because essentially they could claim this is an act of God, everyone's affected, no country has handled this perfectly. That will not be the case in the fall and winter. If the virus comes back, we expect that there will be much more political and social upheaval as populations will essentially have way less sort of leniency with their political leaders because they'll be able to compare between those countries that have taken the summer to prepare and handle the second wave well versus those that have just essentially had a short memory and essentially thought that everything's over so we can now move forward. And with that, I'll stop there and turn it back over to Aaron for questions. Thanks, everyone.
Andrew, thank you very much. Extremely valuable insights. I certainly have a number of questions, but I thought what we do is we do have a question right out of the gate for Richard. And the question is as follows. How do you handle a narrow hallway, which is too small for two-way directional, and there's only one path, meaning hallway does not wrap around the space? So those tight corridors, what do we do about those, Richard?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and it's each space is going to present its its kind of own pinch points, right? We had those little red dots on the plans. There's a couple of ways you can do it. You can, in a reduced capacity on the space, you can eliminate that corridor from your path at all. So if there's 2 offices and 3 workstations back there, you relocate your folks to the areas where you can manage the passing. The second, the more, that's kind of an extreme version. The secondary version of that is you just wear PPE, because the passing in the hallway, you're going to bring down 85% of your contagion particles if you're wearing a cloth face mask. So if you do require in certain areas, you can put a sign up that says, this is a PPE area, right? So if you're not wearing them at your desks, hypothetically, if you're going to that part of the floor, you need your PPE so that when you're crossing, you don't have that situation. So that's basically a couple of ways to deal with that. And it really depends on how the space layout and what functions are down that corridor.
Thank you, Richard. John, I think you have a comment to share.
Yeah, thank you very much to both panelists, to both really excellent and complimentary information. I do have a quick comment on Andrew. You know, I think away from the personalities, we've had a couple of webinars here, and you can see them on the website. The friction between both Brazil, let's say, and the United States have federal system, and you have sort of systems, you have sort of different variations across this hemisphere. And this is a very natural tension between the executive and governors and local leaders, because the closer you are to the pandemic, the more cautious you're going to be. And those that are away from it can see the forest for the trees. And what we found, you know, especially in the Brazilian case in the United States, but Colombia, who's done a very good job in locking down, Chile, Peru, all have seen this tension. It's away from the personalities. There is a tension from recovery and lockdown. And I think that's in the main, you know, we're looking, especially looking at Brazil and the United States, our political systems are dealing with it pretty well. It's ugly at times, of course, and certainly the recent strains from, you know, have created some big problems. But in terms of plans of opening and so forth, you've seen an interaction, sometimes not very pleasant to watch, but it seems to be working, as opposed to compared to, you know, the sort of more dirigist regimes that you were talking about, especially in China. That's my comment.
Yeah, and if I can just respond to that, I completely agree. I think, you know, essentially when you have a federalized system and decentralization, and it's the same in Germany, by the way, which has been less contentious, or at least less reported, less obvious, you know, less acrimonious, but it's been the same situation where you've had very decentralized responses. Essentially, I think what you get is better outcomes, and this echoes what you were saying. You get better outcomes because you're able to adjust the regulation to the local conditions, but it's much messier, as you were hinting at. And as a consequence, I think as an investor and from an outside perspective, it's much more complicated to track, right? So we've been helping our clients, for example, track some of the state and local sort of you know, regulations and approaches, and it's a total patchwork. So yeah, I would tend to agree. What you don't want, however, is a situation like in India or to a certain degree in South Africa, though it's not so much due to the regionalism in South Africa, but more to intra-cabinet tensions, but a situation where essentially the instructions that are being shared are completely at odds with one another, right? Because that leaves both the population, that's been a big issue in South Africa, it leaves the population completely clueless as to where the government wants to go. But I would tend to agree with you, absolutely.
Great. Richard, another question for you. The question came up regarding those types of offices that do not have operable windows. And since you're in a closed airspace without ventilation, what do you do in those situations? Like what actions are buildings taking there?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Originally, when this thing first came down in early March, everybody was shutting their HVAC systems off because they were worried about blowing stuff all around the offices. And the ASHRAE has recently come out with some very, very scientific guidance around how buildings should maintain their HVAC. The first thing right off the bat is always run your HVAC system. It is incredibly important because there is a natural filtration and a natural air exchange where fresh air comes into the building. They are also giving guidance that you should upgrade your filtration to MERV 13 or MERV 14. That is a a density range. Most buildings run in the 8 to 9 range, and as you get higher, you get more medical grade, and smaller particulates are caught in that fibrous membrane. So they're trying to get those upgraded to MERV 13 or 14. They recently came out with, just the last week, they recently came out with some more guidance that flushing out the building air overnight, in other words, 100% fresh air and just run for 3 or 4 hours, the HVAC systems to just completely flush out old stale air is a good practice as well. So lots of buildings don't have operable windows. Many of them are not allowed by code due to fall dangers. So this is a very common problem. I can tell you that HVAC systems will need to respond to your question, but you should not ever shut off your HVAC system. And there is obviously recent findings that it's much harder to find to transfer on surfaces. So to get that air circulating and removed with fresh air is very important.
Great. And a follow-up to your presentation, Richard, when it comes to preparing buildings as it relates to cleaning, what types of additional costs are we looking at as if you're a landlord or a tenant in a building?
Yeah, I actually, the costs of the cleaning and the solutions we don't see a change in cost on. What we are seeing the impact is the frequency with which we clean. So depending on your specific lease or your building, you're getting cleaned once a day, sometimes once every other day if your population is relatively low. That's not a great cadence of cleanliness for surface contaminants, right? So we're seeing people do their cleaning from potentially twice or 3 times a week to twice or 3 times a day. So what we're really seeing is labor costs increase, not necessarily material costs, because to buy a Lysol disinfecting wipe versus another wipe is, it's inconsequential. So what we're seeing, I don't know, I actually queried recently my asset management lead for the tri-state to see if they've quantified actual dollar costs per square foot yet. They haven't gotten that data yet because this is relatively new. But I'm assuming that your cleaning costs on a monthly basis will probably increase by 25 to 50%, depending on the protocols you increase to and how you're cleaning. So I think larger organizations will see a slightly higher rate of cost, and smaller companies where they're managing some of that cleaning on an employee level will not be as impacted.
Great, thank you. And switching gears to you, Andrew, I recently watched a webinar conducted by Dr. Doom, Nouriel Roubini, who made some pretty dark predictions as relates to what happens if there's a second wave, and he talked about this sort of L-shaped type of recovery. You have to take what he says with a grain of salt, but again, he was successful in predicting the housing crisis and the bubble thereafter. So I'm just curious as to your thoughts about sort of the worst case scenarios here and what that looks like.
Absolutely. So everyone has their favorite letter, right? So we've gone for a math sign, and we are big believers, and we haven't, we didn't invent this, but we are big believers in the Squareroot Recovery, where essentially you're operating at such low levels of economic activity during the lockdown that the rebound that ensues, by definition, if only due to base effects, looks almost like a V initially, but then indeed probably plateaus, because there is a direct trade-off between remaining safe and having extremely high sort of social and thereby economic activity. So what I mean by that is Richard has been talking a lot about some of the ways in which we can stay safe and still operate economically. And I think that is 100% accurate. If you want to find technical ways of operating amidst the pandemic and keeping sort of activity going, it is absolutely doable, technically speaking. Our concern, and maybe it's because we're a little bit biased as a social and political analysis shop, but our concern is that from a socio-political standpoint, populations are just not going to maintain that level of discipline, both because they don't have it. I mean, many populations don't have that level of discipline to start with. And second, because again, there's an inherent tension, and this has to do with, the way the brain works, basically, where the minute that the precautions you're taking work, you let your guard down, right? And so that's why we're a little bit worried. Now, specifically in terms of how we think about not so much the recovery per se, but sort of what the economy looks like in general in the next year or two. The way we've been thinking about it is we think that countries that will be the most vulnerable are the ones that are dependent, 1, on tourism, 2, on oil exports, 3, on commodity exports, and 4, on sort of just general trade exports, so non-commodity manufactured goods. Essentially, what that means is that the countries that will be doing the best, if you will, are those that are fairly self-contained. So essentially, those that do not depend on exports for a large share of their GDP, exports or tourism, excuse me. So essentially have large domestic markets. And then within that, you want to be looking at countries where, quote unquote, obviously a lot of the activity can be done remotely. So the sort of one-to-one the correlation with services is not there quite exactly because, of retail, et cetera, which are non-digital services, but to a certain extent, developed markets will do better as well as sort of emerging markets that sort of are based on outsourcing and services. And then the third is, every country is known to have a high dependence on SMEs, right, on small and medium-sized enterprises. But they're beyond that general talking point, that so-called Germany and China and the U.S., they're all supposedly dependent on SMEs. But there is a lot of granularity within that. And we do think that, sadly, countries with a lower dependence on SMEs will probably fare better. And the reason for this is because it is easier to install, adaptations, for example, to your infrastructure, like the ones that Richard was talking about, if you're a large company. It's a little bit like the trade war, right? Any type of compliance or friction cost is easier to handle for large companies. And similarly, even, fiscal stimulus and government support measures have, and it's sad, but they have been easier to channel towards large companies. So for example, in China, there's been really good work by, I forget if it was Rhodium or Marco Polo, but one of those sort of China analysis shops that essentially showed that the rebound had been dramatic amongst SOEs and pretty stern and pretty, sort of limited within the private sector, which is primarily smaller companies. So that's how we're thinking about. I don't think the bottom line here, the conclusion is, I don't think we should be looking at the next couple of years in terms of V or L or frankly even square root in the long run. I think that's a helpful mechanism to think about the initial reopening, but rather as sort of what are the criteria through which, the lenses through which you're looking at which countries and which sectors to pick for investments.
May I comment just quickly on that? Thank you very much, Andrew. Having been an emerging market economist, I've lived through a lot of these things. And I think the only reference that many of the analysts on Wall Street especially have is 2008, 2009. And this is completely different. But it's behaving just the same. And it's a question of mathematics. If you look at growth rates, you have this big negative growth rate. And then even if you get back to zero, it looks like a V. It's going to be a V. And it doesn't mean you're going to get back to the same level of activity, same level of the market. It's just a question of arithmetic. There is the rubber band effect, right? Milton Friedman, I think, first came up with this, but I've seen a lot of empirical stuff. I did something years ago on this. But the harder you pull down on the rubber band, the faster it snaps back. But it's mostly arithmetic, as you said. It's a low base, or when you're completely stopped. When you start moving again, your acceleration is infinite, and so these numbers will look like V's. It doesn't mean we're going to get back to something we had pre-pandemic, and it is a different type of deal. This is much more like a typical emerging market country because it affects the country usually itself as opposed to being imported from abroad. So anyway, thank you.
Well, John, we're approaching that 11 o'clock hour. Any closing remarks from your perspective?
Well, let's see. Richard, do you want to finish off with something, and Andy, do you want to say a final thing, and then I'll close it up.
Sure. Look, I think the thing I would leave it with is, and I always try to find a little bit of a silver lining in everything we deal with. I am constantly amazed at the resilience and the innovation and some of the incredible technology that will no doubt come out of this situation that we've all been forced to deal with, from from contact tracing, as Andrew had mentioned, to touchless elevators from your smartphone, to how we prepare for the next pandemic. I think there's going to be some really incredible innovations that come out of this, and we're starting to see some of that now. UVGI treatment of air HVAC systems to kill pathogens in the air. I just think there's going to be some really incredible things that come out of this. And if there's any positive, the ingenuity and innovation of humans in these situations is really amazing. So if there's any positive here, I would like to say that I'm interested to see what comes out of all this and how we evolve.
And Andrew, do you have a final word for us?
Very, very briefly. I mean, from my end, I would say two things. One is the fact that we are all concerned citizens, and if anything, we're concerned by the virus personally, right? And we all have loved ones who are more vulnerable. But I do think that it's important from an investment standpoint not to try to sort of conflate the medical priorities with the economic priorities. So what I mean by that is that a lot of consulting firms have been trying to argue that, you can sort of invest in sort of the caution and simultaneously get the same level of economic recovery. And I think there will inevitably be a trade-off. I'm thinking not so much in terms of sectors of activities, but rather globally. And what I mean by that is that essentially, if there is a second wave, the countries that will fare better economically will likely be the ones that essentially go for a herd immunity approach. And that is not an endorsement of the approach, but I think it is something to bear in mind. The second, which is related, is that, again, from a technical standpoint, the solutions are there. Richard has outlined many of them, and it is absolutely possible to be responsible from a technical standpoint. What we're worried about is, again, sociopolitical dynamics and basically populations and leaders not following through with those solutions. So I would keep a close eye on sort of political behaviors, not just what you're reading about, the quality of the latest test or the quality of the latest treatment.
Well, thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Richard, for a great webinar. And thank you especially to Aaron and Cushman Wakefield for putting this together. Aaron, what a great job you've done in moderating this. Thank you all. I just wanted to remind you that tomorrow we will have a virtual happy hour at 4 p.m. where we'll hear the ephemeral sounds of Yaron Federico Govea. Our next more informational webinar will take place next Tuesday, 9th of June, COVID-19 Next Steps, Insolvency, Bankruptcy, and Distressed Acquisitions in Brazil. Thank you all for attending. Stay healthy and in good spirits.